Hi, Misha here, and last time we talked about the somewhat underwhelming, but still very important intermediate transitional T-62, an iterative improvement over the T-55. But now we're going to talk about what had been its competition throughout the 50s and really was the next step forward. In fact, this is considered the second generation main battle tank in Soviet service. And it had many firsts and was, well respected in the world when it was introduced and is still in service today. And actually, the T-64 here was never intended for export, unlike the 54, 55, and 62. This so-called high technology tank was reserved for Soviet forces, and even at that, in the beginning, kind of elite frontline forces such as Europe. That's actually why the 62 was sent to Afghanistan in the 80s primarily. So let's talk about it. Let's start off with this model, 172 scale from, I believe, Model Collect. I've had this one a while. Really a neat design, and it should be, because this was from Morozov, designer of the T-34, T-44, and initial designer of the T-54 before the OKB, the Design Bureau, took it over with the 55, and then of course that led to the 62. But the Morozov Design Bureau really started working on this in the early 50s, 51, 52, to be the next generation tank. And the idea was to integrate new technologies in manufacturing techniques. And this would become the Object 430. It had an all-new engine style. It was lighter, simpler, had a different piston arrangement. In fact, the engine compartment was half the size of on the T-54, 55. It also had a lightweight suspension system using more alloy. So the design was quite a bit lighter, while still having very good performance and what have you. At this time, it still used the same 100mm gun that was kind of ubiquitous in Russia. And in the end, that's kind of what its problem was. It just didn't seem that much of a step forward. And so that's kind of why the T-62 was put into production and the Object 430 was not. However, the Design Bureau tried to tell the powers that be that they were working on a bigger leap forward, the Object 432. But it wasn't ready in time. They were in a hurry. The 432 would go on to use the same 115mm smoothbore gun as the T-62, but with one critical difference. It had an auto loader for the gun, kind of the carousel style. This took the loader out of the equation, meaning the crew was 3. Now, it also had new composite armor, which was originally steel, aluminum alloy steel sandwich, which gave greater effective protection compared to just a traditional steel armor, even slope steel armor. As we saw with the T-62, it could easily be penetrated by a lot of modern anti-tank weapons. The new Object 432 would not be so vulnerable. So autoloader this, and to kind of counter the added weight, basically they took weight off and then it went back on with the armor, but then they uprated the engine, so it actually remained quite maneuverable. The whole notion behind the Object 430 and 432 was to show that a medium tank could have the same protection and firepower as a heavy tank. And it was quite successful, because by the time it was adopted, the heavy tank was essentially no more. It was main battle tanks. The 432, with all the most up-to-date improvements in features and what have yous, NBC protections and all that stuff. Latest night vision of the time was ready in September of 1962 and would be put into rate production just over a year later in October of 63. But it would take some time with testing, and it wasn't officially adopted by the Red Army until 1966. And this is really what allowed the T-62 to flourish for a brief time. And the T-64, like I said, had the 115 millimeter main gun, crew of 3, quite advanced armor for that day and time. And depending on the model, the top speed can range anywhere from 50 to 60 kilometers per hour. Had good maneuverability. Unfortunately, the new engine, while lightweight, wasn't as reliable as previous engines, so it would take a few iterations to really get that right. Now, the version we would more know, the T-64A, work was really underway 1965, 1966, with testing happening. The main jump with the A was going to an improved 125 millimeter smoothbore gun. Now, back during testing with the new turret and ring that was on the Object 430, 432, they had tried as large as 122 millimeter gun, so it could take the upboard gun. And the reason they did this was to counter the US M60A1, which Russia got their hands on in the mid-60s thanks to an Iranian defector. So it was there. They also took the opportunity to improve the composite armor, switching out the alloy in the middle for fiberglass, lighter and more effective. And they would continue to tweak the engine. They would add some extra storage boxes on the side, give better night vision. This would become the Object 434, and it was ready to go in 1969, was selected for service as the T-64A, and started to be fielded in 1970, which is also the first time this new fancy tank was kind of shown off to the public and in parades and whatnot. So the T-64A was the prime version. They only built about 600 of the original T-64s. The one with the bigger gun was kind of always the one that was called upon. Now these were about the same length, about 9.3 meters as earlier tanks. Started off at about 36 tons, quickly would grow to 38. In fact, some later versions would grow up to 45 tons as things were added like reactive armor. The 125 millimeter main gun had 28 rounds ready in the auto-loading carousel, plus about another 8 that were stowed around the tank. It had a coaxially mounted PKT machine gun with about 1,250 rounds, and by 1970-72, that period, the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun was standard with 300 rounds. And it was on the commander's hatch since the loader is now gone. So the A was really the primary production model, and started to really get out there in the early 70s. The first place Russia would deploy these would be Eastern Germany. This was meant to be a European defensive tank. This was meant to be their best tank to go up against what the Allies might conjure. It would also soon be stationed in Hungary and then elsewhere. First, more elite units, frontline units got it. Later, more regular army units would receive it too. But work would continue, starting to be known as the Object 447. They tried to improve the engine, and at this time, the 70s, multi-fuel was kind of the buzzword, as the British. So there was an improved engine introduced around 1975 that not only was diesel-powered, but could also go from gasoline or even kerosene. So that would be integrated into the next versions. Also, guided missiles being fired from the main gun, which would come about as the Cobra and later Songster types would be able to be launched from these. And a few other minor updates as well. Thus, in 1976, the T-64B was first ready to go. It also had a thermal sleeve put on the main gun, something you start to see with a lot of British and Israeli tanks too. And it would take a little while for this to really get into Red Army service, but by the very early 80s you started to see T-64Bs around. Also, a lot of the older tanks were upgraded to either the A or the B standard, depends on who you ask, but it seems like it's more the A standard because it's more practical. So basically they were upgunned, and these would be the T-64Rs, and this program would last from the late 70s through the mid 80s. And production would continue. In the period around 1985, they started to put reactive armor tiles on some of these. These would be known as the T-64BV. But this is pretty short-lived because production was halted in 1987. That's because it was being replaced by the newer T-80 and it had its own features there. But service would not end, not far from it. How many were built? Estimates are as low as 8,000 and as high as 16,000. But sources like Wikipedia have 13,000, so smack dab in the middle. We'll go with that. So a large number, but fewer than previous tanks. And it's due in some part because this was a more complicated tank to produce. And it was more expensive than even the T-62, which itself was more expensive than the T-55. So, yeah, you can understand why, but this was them trying to combat the most up-to-date Western tanks, and it had much better protection. The autoloader worked better than you would think. The engine, while never as reliable as others, definitely grew into its own later on. And it was a well-respected tank. In fact, it's still in service today. Here we actually have the 62 next to the 64, and in terms of the hull, the tanks are pretty close. But yeah, different main guns and a lot different technology under the hood. Since the T-64 was kind of kept in Europe, it didn't really see combat until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Afterwards, Russia would inherit at least 4,000 of these, and Belarus would inherit some, as would Uzbekistan. But Ukraine would actually inherit over 2,000, and they would inherit the factory that actually made these, who also made the T-80 as it happens. So while development in Russia would end for the T-64, it actually would continue in Ukraine. But Russia would field these in the 90s in quite large numbers. And they would be used in the Chechen Wars and in Georgia. But by 2014, when things started to heat up with the Crimea and then soon with Syria, they were slated for being scrapped. But they were still much in reserve, and officially today they still list them as a tank in reserve and second line service, so technically there still might be some kicking about. Again, the later versions like the BV are not hopelessly antiquated. Now in Ukraine, in 1999, they introduced a couple of upgrade packages, actually several packages, but the two prime ones were the T-64 BM, there's also later a BM2, and the T-64U. The BM had an upgrade to the engine. Actually, they got its top speed up to 70 kilometers per hour. Improved ordnance for the cannon, able to use newer missiles. and also improved some of the sighting control systems. The 64U is interesting too because of the new command and control systems. It could be operated by as few as one person. Not ideal, but in an emergency, the commander could drive and even operate the main gun. So a bit of automation and kind of workload separation there. These would be offered here and there through the former Soviet Union, and in 2010 the first deliveries were made to the Ukrainian government, with subsequent deliveries in the next couple of years. Not really sure how many they have in service today, anywhere from 70 to 100 upgraded versions, plus as many, anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 older T-64s, although it's hard to say how many of them are in full working order or not. But they are there, and they have done what they could to modernize them. Kind of reminds me of how they treated their Sukhoi Su-27 fighter craft. And that's kind of it. It's a very neat design. It's a neat looking model. Again, this one's from Fabry. Well, I mean, these both are, you know what I mean. A little bit different. Notice the bin on the back of the turret here. Of course, it does rotate. I like the square on the side. This is kind of interesting. Not a forgotten tank, and this is the first one we're getting to that's still potentially in service today, but very much in reserve use. But the next two we're going to talk about are still front line, at least in their upgraded versions. But that's next time. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.